Hello, my name is Carolyn, and today I'm going to talk about a meta-analysis done on the relationship between self-compassion and well-being. Self-compassion describes a positive and caring attitude of a person towards her or himself in the face of failures and individual shortcomings. As a result of this caring attitude, individuals high in self-compassion are assumed to experience higher individual well-being. This meta-analysis examines the relationship between self-compassion and the different forms of well-being. In psychological research, different conceptualizations of well-being have been suggested. There is no one definition or approach to well-being, but there are two very prominent and well-explored approaches to well-being, which are subjective well-being and psychological well-being. This meta-analysis focuses on these two approaches. Subjective well-being describes how people evaluate their lives, including emotional and cognitive judgments. Generally, subjective well-being can be divided into two different parts: cognitive well-being and affective well-being. Cognitive well-being characterizes the cognitive evaluation of life, which is often called life satisfaction. Affective well-being characterizes the presence of positive or pleasant effects and the absence of negative or unpleasant effects. These two aspects are two very distinctive parts of subjective well-being and should be analyzed separately. Psychological well-being, on the other hand, characterizes a more eudaimonic view of well-being. It describes the fulfillment of human potential and a meaningful life. Psychological well-being is associated with the pursuit of realization of one's true potential and focuses on the optimal functioning of the individual. As with cognitive well-being, aspects of psychological well-being underlie cognitive evaluations, but they concern aspects of an individual's functioning rather than the cognitive well-being. Next, I'm going to talk about the methods that were used to do this meta-analysis. So the literature research was designed to include published and unpublished works on the present topic. Studies were limited to those written in English or German. A broad literature search was conducted in the databases PsycInfo, PubPsych, and PubMed, as well as the German language databases of PsycIndex and MedPilot. The literature search was performed up to May 2015 and includes all studies published up till then. Keywords with different wildcard characters and logical operations were used to locate relevant articles, which were self-compassion, well-being, life satisfaction, positive effect, negative effect, happiness, and quality of life. These keywords were selected according to the relevant theories and were oriented towards existing meta-analysis. In total, 1,422 potential articles were identified and examined. Now I'm going to talk about the inclusion criteria. So in order to determine which articles were most relevant to the study, 6 inclusion criteria were created, which were the first one, quantitative data. Only studies with quantitative data were included in the analysis. Publications which only reported qualitative data, reviews, or theoretical works were excluded. Next was measurement of self-compassion. Self-compassion was measured with a standardized questionnaire. Missing information about the single subscales of self-compassion was not an exclusion criteria. The main analysis was performed with the global self-compassion score. Concerning the research question regarding the causal effect, studies including a self-compassion manipulation were also coded. Next was measurement of well-being. Studies had to report at least one type of well-being measurement, whether that be cognitive, affective, psychological, or other type of well-being. This measurement had to be conducted using a standardized questionnaire. Study design. There were no exclusion criteria for particular study designs. However, for the main analysis, only baseline data was used. Concerning the research question regarding the causal relationship, repeated measures data of experimental or intervention designs were also coded. Next was statistical requirements. Only studies with a reported correlation coefficient between self-compassion and measurements of well-being or corresponding information could be included in the analysis. In cases where this information was missing, the authors were contacted and the study was included if necessary information could be obtained. Finally, was moderators. No content-specific exclusion criteria were applied regarding potential moderators. Concerning the construct self-esteem, the only criteria for inclusion in the moderator analysis was that self-esteem had to be measured with the self-report questionnaire. So there was a couple of phases that were part of the exclusion process. The first phase, in the first phase, all 1,433 articles were screened. In this process, 1,269 articles were excluded because no quantitative data was reported, no self-comparison was measured, and no well-being was mentioned. In the second phase, the remaining 1,164 articles were reviewed in detail, in which 99 articles were excluded because they did not meet the remaining inclusion criteria. After this, 65 articles with 79 examples were included in the quantitative synthesis. So overall, of the 1,433 identified articles, 79 samples contained usable data, which were the samples used in the meta-analysis. In this meta-analysis, 3 research questions guided the analysis. The first question examined whether there are differences in the relationship between self-compassion and different forms of well-being. Results showed that these relationships are significantly different from each other. The analysis found the strong correlation between self-compassion and psychological well-being, followed by negative effect with cognitive well-being. Finally, positive affective well-being correlates with self-compassion. These correlation coefficients can be interpreted as medium to large effect sizes. The relationships to psychological and cognitive forms of well-being are slightly stronger than the relationships to affective forms of well-being. More precisely, positive affective well-being. It is quite plausible that psychological well-being has the highest correlation with self-compassion because it is a much broader construct and addresses more specific aspects of managing one's life. The second research question examined the influence of different moderators on the relationship between self-compassion and well-being. Regarding different demographic variables, the analysis showed a significant effect of female portion. The higher the values, the stronger the relationship. On the relationship between self-compassion and well-being, furthermore, there was a significant effect on the psychological construct of self-esteem. The higher the values, the weaker the relationship on cognitive well-being. Female proportion also marginally moderated the relationship with cognitive well-being. The relationship also differed in relation to geographical region of the samples. European samples reached a higher correlation coefficient than did North American samples, and the relationship between self-compassion and cognitive well-being. Finally, the age of the participants marginally influenced the relationship between self-compassion and psychological well-being. The older the participants, the stronger the relationship. So there were 3 primary results from this second question. The first interesting result was that gender differences showed that males report slightly higher levels of self-compassion than females. However, an explanation may reside within the findings that women generally have higher magnitudes and related to constructs such as empathy. Thus, the effectiveness of self-compassion could be enhanced. Also, the generally faster adaptation rate of women after a negative experience such as bereavement could be an explanation. Self-compassion may accelerate this process and thus could explain, to some extent, the difference between men and women in handling such experience. Another interesting result is the marginal effect of participants' age on the relationship between self-compassion and psychological well-being. An explanation could be related to the characteristics of the construct psychological well-being. Subscale measurements such as environmental mastery or positive relations with others increase over one's lifespan. Age could buffer the relationship because of more experienced situations that serve as a comparison level. The older a person becomes, the more negative and positive situations are experienced. It seems that this primarily influences the relationship with psychological well-being rather than other forms of well-being. Finally, the last interesting result was the moderating effect of self-esteem on the relationship between self-compassion and cognitive well-being. Self-esteem weakens the correlation coefficient. Self-esteem relies more on global positive self-evaluations and often is based on comparisons with others in order to increase one's perceived self-worth. By comparison, self-compassion works in quite the opposite way. It is not strictly based on self-evaluation and comparison with others, but is rather based on interconnection and the awareness of being part of mankind, as well as the awareness that failure and setbacks are a normal part of life. It seems that these comparisons may weaken the relationship between self-compassion and well-being. Self-esteem influences the evaluation of situations and therefore interferes with the self-compassion in such situations. Unfortunately, there were not enough studies to examine the effect of self-esteem with the other forms of well-being compared to cognitive well-being. Future studies should be considered with these findings. The third research question examined the causal relationship between self-compassion and well-being. Both state self-compassion manipulations and trait self-compassion interventions showed a statistically significant effect on the causal influence of self-compassion and well-being. The meta-analysis also indicated that a causal relationship between self-compassion and well-being exists. There is a broad diversity of training interventions and other approaches to successfully increase self-compassion in the long term. Short-term manipulations for experimental research questions are much more limited and less diverse. However, it is necessary to apply different approaches and design to manipulate self-compassion. Furthermore, a deep understanding of the relationship between self-compassion and well-being would be provided if experimental designs also manipulated only single subcomponents of self-compassion to examine their specific causal effect on well-being and on other subscales of self-compassion. So, in conclusion, the results clearly highlight the importance of self-compassion for an individual's well-being. At the same time, the analysis helps to investigate new research questions. The diversity in the relationship between self-compassion and the different forms of well-being emphasizes the specific need to distinguish between the single operationalization of well-being. In future studies, the scientific research community should examine the influence of possible moderators in particular, as well as the behavior of the relationship on the subscale level and the stability in the long-term investigations. This will help to gain a more complete understanding of the nature of the relationship between self-compassion and well-being. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, please email me.